Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Combat Zone. I'm Nick. He's Joe. And we got a show for you. And remember, this is the place where the enemy only has four things to say. Abandon ship, bail out, take cover, and we surrender. Because we don't give any quarter, and we don't take any prisoners. All right. We've got quite a show lined up for you this evening. We have talking about some...
You always say that, Nick. You always say that we have quite a show lined up.
That's because we do. We're that good.
We're that good.
Absolutely.
Did you say that you're Nick and I'm Joe? I've already forgotten. Right. That's my short-term memory loss.
Yeah, I actually got it right.
And we got the mics. We actually reversed the microphones tonight so that the mic switches, I should say, so that we're not accidentally turning them off when we should be leaving on. Yes. Anyway, why should we be boring you guys with these technical details?
It is a question that had come to mind. Yes.
Yes.
Anyway, I just want to say good evening, everybody. You can always join us in the chat room over here at
thecombatzone.ca.
That's it. See, yeah. My memory is working good, just not that good.
Yeah, well, of course, they're already on if they're listening to us.
Oh, that's true. So you can join us by clicking on the little chat bubble. And if you haven't registered yet, go ahead and do that. It's almost painless. If I can do it, anybody can.
And that's to save us from any problems with non-human.
Yeah.
Non-human.
That filters out
non-human trafficking.
That's right. That filters out.
We don't want any aliens here.
No aliens.
No aliens here, and apparently no aliens in Southern California.
Well.
No new aliens.
We will. We may get into that a little later.
We may.
In the second hour of the show, we've got some stuff to talk about before we get to that. But second hour, we have our Western correspondent, Roy Beyer, is joining us from all the way out there in dissatisfied land, otherwise known as Alberta. And they have every reason to be dissatisfied, to put it mildly. We'll be talking, so that'll come up in the second hour. We also have, in the first hour, we'll be talking about the GM plant closures and all the stuff that you wait all week to hear what we have to say about.
That's right, because
we're the best.
Well, I don't know about the best, but we're certainly interested.
We're the best radio show they listen to between 9 and 11 Wednesday night at the Combat Zone.
.ca.
That's right.
Okay, you can also call in live, toll-free anywhere in North America. Our number to call is 844-415-2115. That number again, 844-415-2115.
All of that will work. Trust me. Been there, done that, bought the T-shirt.
Okay. This is exciting because, I actually am using a different laptop computer. So I spent the last 2 hours making sure that all of our settings were right. And, if you joined us right at 9 o'clock, you probably noticed that we didn't click on live right at 9 o'clock. We were about 45 seconds late. And that was because we were finishing up the settings on the computer right until the very last moment, and even a little bit over time. So I'm hoping that everybody is hearing properly. If you are having problems hearing, send us a message in the chat room, and we will immediately address the technical difficulties. And BREXIT. So let's talk a little bit about BREXIT.
Good
Nick,
idea.
we haven't talked at all about anything going on.
We haven't laid a finger on Brexit.
In England, Great Britain, the United Kingdom, and it's on the ongoing saga of the divorce between the United Kingdom and the European Union, and it's gotten quite nasty over there. Actually,
well, it's a marriage that never should have happened in the first place.
Well, they had. I don't recall if they had a referendum at the time, but
I don't remember either.
It was controversial because the original European Common Market didn't include England, and it took some time to coax England. I should say the United Kingdom, because England is only one of the component parts of the United Kingdom.
England,
actually
Scotland,
keep forgetting
Ireland,
that.
Wales.
England, Scotland,
Ireland, and Wales.
Northern Ireland, not all of Ireland.
Oh,
right, just Northern Ireland.
Wow.
That little corner in Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom. And then the Irish Republic, of course, was part of the United Kingdom, but they broke away in after World War I.
Yeah, between the wars.
That's right.
Because Churchill was really ticked at the Irish Republic for not letting them use
During the Second World War.
During the Second World War, for not
Correct.
letting you use their harbors and land for air bases.
Yeah, the Irish Republic was quote unquote neutral in the Second World War. You're absolutely right.
Yep.
Okay, so just a little bit of geography. You're right.
Mm-hmm.
So the United Kingdom consists of England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. Now, Great Britain is just England, Wales, and Scotland. It doesn't include Northern Ireland. So that's why the actual official name is the United Kingdom of Great Britain, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland.
Something like that. Look, I don't know how they could. I love the British. I really do. I think they're fantastic people. You know, we share a lot in common with them, that kind of thing. But how do they turn that into such a dog's breakfast for a name?
Well, I don't know. They're trying to be inclusive, but you know, it's an interesting point because you'll recall that shortly after the federal election, the general election here in 2015, our new Liberal Prime Minister Justin Trudeau travels to, I believe it was New York. He gives a speech. It was about a month or 2 months after the election, and he talks about Canada being the world's first post-nation state. And you know, he clearly doesn't know his history because the United Kingdom was a post-nation state long before Canada, and because there are the four nationalities that make up the United Kingdom, or the English, the Welsh, and in Wales they speak a separate language.
Absolutely.
Scotland and Northern Ireland.
I have a future son-in-law who's studying the Irish language. It's not
Gaelic, right? It's Gaelic?
No. It's Irish.
It's Irish.
Yeah, I don't know how to put it. Maybe it's like French versus Quebec French. They're very distinct.
Could be. Yeah,
but you know, to the untrained ear, you might not pick it up. But anyway, so he's been having a lot of fun learning that. All right. Brexit is the reason I say it's a marriage that never should have happened, because I think they gave up way too much for what they got out of it.
Well, I don't know that they, at least originally, I mean, the concept is not bad. It was, first of all, just a little bit of history here. The European Union is the outgrowth of what was originally the European coal market or coal union. I can't remember what they called it, which was originally, the concept was that shortly after the Second World War, as Germany was starting to rebuild, that the French and the Germans in particular got together and they created a common market for energy, which at that time was principally coal.
Right.
And the notion being that if the two countries that were really ancient enemies, now Germany had not been independent country for very long. They only became independent an actual country in 1871 or thereabouts.
Yeah, that was Bismarck did that.
Right. So Germany actually as a country is younger than Canada is, but there had been a number of Germanic states and principalities, duchies, independent city-states, etc. And there had been a lot of warfare, conflict between France and these Germanic states individually or collectively in different combinations. And then, of course, there was the Franco-Prussian War of 1870.
Which set the stage for World War I.
And then there was the war of, then there was the First World War, then there was the Second World War, and so the idea was that if they created some kind of strong economic bonds between France and Germany, then that would create a condition where whatever else was going on between those two countries and the people and the governments, that there would be a real reluctance to actually allow things to deteriorate to such a degree that they were actually shooting at one another, because it would ruin their economies. Of course, World War II ruined their economies anyway, even without that. But that was the idea, and not a bad idea. And that, of course, evolved over a period of time with different treaties. Different countries became involved. The economic union grew. It expanded to cover different areas, etc. And so what you really had was a common market, and that for a time, that's what they called themselves, the European Common Market.
Right.
And really what it was a free trade zone. And when the United Kingdom joined the European Union, okay, the common market, that was what it was all about. It was about free trade. It was a customs union. It was about free movement of goods and eventually people between the countries within the zone. But this is what happened post the British joining the Union, and that is that it became much more than just an economic zone. First of all, it became very bureaucratic. Not that it wasn't bureaucratic before,
right,
but it became stupidly bureaucratic, where the European government, Parliament, and the bureaucrats in Brussels who work for the European Union were more and more and more creating regulations and imposing these regulations on the constituent states. And then, of course, there was the European Court of Justice that became a sort of a supranational Supreme Court overruling judicial decisions in the individual countries and imposing standards and laws and regulations on those countries. So anyway, eventually the British, as you know, they just got tired of it. They just the hands of Parliament in many instances were tied.
Well, 75% of their laws were made in Brussels.
I don't know what the percentage is, but it was...
I'm taking that according to Nigel Farage. But the point that I would make is a lot of good ideas on paper are bad ideas in reality. Take the League of Nations. It lasted in Japan until Japan walked out before World War II because they just said, sorry, no, we're not playing that, got up and left. And that would kill the League of Nations, I should say.
Right.
The United Nations was even worse. Because while it sounded great, and Churchill was all about it, because he didn't like war, anybody, and that if it had stuck to its original mandate, then everything would have been fine. But the problem with these organizations, and the European Union is no different, is that, as my son would say, the bureaucracy expands to meet the needs of the expanding bureaucracy.
Right. That's a good way of phrasing it, actually.
Absolutely, because what happens is they have to justify their existence. So that's how you end up with people inspecting bananas to have the right curve in Europe. And if they're not, they can't sell the bananas. Or checking cabbages so they weigh the right amount, or carrots to make sure they're the right color. It's insane the kind of silliness that goes on over there. And you're quite right that people got fed up with it. They didn't have their own fishing rights. They didn't have they want to send their sardine fleets out, but there were quotas imposed by the greater European Union. And that now they're even talking about putting together a European army. And Marcon says it's to defend Europe against invading Americans.
Partly.
That's what, yeah.
Partly.
But that's the part that
to defend
matters.
itself against. Well, I know it's ridiculous.
It's one of the dumbest things.
So the British have a referendum, finally, and they vote, enough, we're leaving, we don't want to have anything to do with this anymore. And so that was a couple of years ago, and now they're in the process of trying to come up with a final agreement, a divorce agreement. And they just did come up with one. They just signed one between the British government under Theresa May, the Prime Minister, and the European Union. The problem is that I don't think that this agreement is actually going to pass the British Parliament, because I don't think it delivers on what they want and what they really need. The idea of Brexit, and look, you and I, Nick, we don't have a dog in this hunt, okay?
That's right.
We're here in Canada, but I think that it's fair to say that we agree that there is a role for nation states to play in our world, and if you respect the democratic rights of the people who are living in your jurisdiction, in this case Great Britain, then you have to understand that the European Union, these bureaucrats in Brussels, should not constantly be overruling the decisions of the British Parliament. And I have to say this, okay? I have to emphasize the British Parliament, the mother of all parliaments, the oldest parliament in the world. So this is not just some passing phase in Great Britain, okay? So,
no, you're right. It's not. But from that perspective, but I've always believed and held firmly to the idea that the largest organization that the individual private citizen can be part of and cling to is the nation state, because that's where beyond that their voice gets so diluted as to be meaningless. I use this example a lot when I'm talking about this, but if you remember the Star Wars movie with Queen Amidala going before the International Federation.
I don't remember it. I don't think I saw it, but I'll take your word for it.
It's the one where my favorite character of all time in Star Wars is featured, Jar Jar Binks.
I still have no idea what you're talking about.
Okay, well, she goes.
I was a Star Trek fan, but
did I say Star Trek? I meant Star Wars.
No. You did. I do think you said Star Wars.
Well, I'm saying Star Wars now in case I didn't. So Queen Amidala goes to this massive body of all the planets in the Federation, and she's floating around on this floating disc, pleading her case with these thousands of delegates from all over the galaxy. And while she's pleading, her planet is being attacked, and a country comes out, one of the invading nation, the invading planet comes out and tells, well, we can't believe all this. We must have an inquiry. We must send fact finders to make sure that we know what's going on. And all he's doing is stalling for time. That's the United Nations. That's the European Union. You get to that point, and you simply don't have any voice. If Canada were to become part of a one-world government, which is what everybody's afraid of, when you hear Trudeau talk about being the first post-national prime minister, that's the first thing that crosses their mind, or at least it does mine. We're 36 million people on a planet with about 7 or 8 billion people on it. So even if every single Canadian voted no to something that was going to have a dramatic effect on us, and everybody else voted yes, we get washed out. Just because we live here, just because we own the property, just because we run the place has no bearing. And this is what happens when you go beyond the nation state. At least with a nation state, a country, you can fire the leadership and install other ones, maybe better, maybe worse, but at least you have some say. And the lower down in level of governments you go, the more powerful that becomes. That's why in a good democracy, powers always devolve to the lowest level, because that's where the rubber meets the road and you can actually have an impact on the way things affect you in your daily life. So when you look at the EU and you look at the UN and organizations that are that massive and wield that kind of power, it just to me strikes me as so wrong, because you don't have enough voice by the private citizen who's hoofing the bill for this to be able to have any real say. And when that happens, it's game over. And that's what I don't like about Brexit. That's why I like Brexit. That's why I like the idea of the breakup of the EU, which I think is coming. You've now got about 4 or 5 of those central states, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Austria, and the Czech Republic. Or did I say them already? Anyway, there's about 4 or 5 central right in the heart of Europe who said, we're just not playing your game anymore.
Right. Well, most of the eastern states that are newer to the European Union are much more resistant to the idea of centralized power in Brussels. And the truth is, as you know, I spent some time over there this summer, a couple of weeks, talking with people in the political field, et cetera. And the reality is that there's a lot of on-the-ground dissatisfaction, even in places like Germany and France, with the European Union, with the bureaucracy and the government that's there. So it's a serious problem. I don't know what the solution to it is going to be, but certainly when once Great Britain leaves, and by the way, they're going to leave. They're going to leave without a deal. I don't think that this deal is going to pass Parliament. And I think that the thing to remember is that people should not panic. There's going to be a lot of stress and strain and predictions that the sky is going to fall and there's going to be economic catastrophe. And I was even hearing today that Brexit, without a divorce deal between Great Britain and the European Union, what they're calling it as a no-deal Brexit, right. Where they just divorce or they go their separate ways and they don't have an agreement on how they're going to regulate things, their trade, prior to the actual breaking up. I was hearing today from some prognosticators that this could be seriously damaging to our economy here in North America, to the U.S. economy, to the Canadian economy. And I'm scratching my head and I'm going, these naysayers, okay, really, I don't understand why they're even thinking that this is going to be a problem for us over here.
We have
there's always economic, there are blips and there are ups and downs, et cetera. So clearly, I'm not going to claim that whatever happens in Europe is going to have zero effect or impact here in Canada or in the United States. But that's not the kind of thing I was hearing today. I was hearing things like, it was talk about my favorite word, right? Catastrophists, right? Yeah. So we have the climate change catastrophists, and we also now have the Brexit catastrophists, and they are laying it thick on the population in Great Britain right now.
People are far more easily intimidated and scared than they are inspired. It takes a lot more energy to inspire people to rise above certain circumstances than it does to scare the crap out of them so they shiver in their hovels and pull the blankets over their head, hoping the world doesn't come crashing down on them. And it's intellectual laziness on one hand, and on the other hand, it's a tactic designed by those who don't want to see the kind of change or return to the nation state with the sovereignty that goes with it, because they might make decisions that the one-worlders don't like and don't fit in with their plans. So they're going to do everything they can to try to scare the average individual who doesn't have the time, quite frankly, to go out and find out what's going on and try to figure out who's on what side and what the truth is. Even I'm no expert on this field either, but even when I go out there and I'm reading different things, I have to check 2 or 3 different sources and then look at those sources and try and figure out, who is it raining, or are these people just peeing on my boots telling me it is? So it takes a lot of effort, in other words, to get to the bottom of things so you have a clearer understanding. Like take Tony Robinson from England, or Tommy Robinson from England. Is he a hero? Is he a sinner? Is he a saint? Well, that depends on what side of the issue you're on, right? I personally think he's an incredibly courageous man for standing up for what he's standing up for. It takes a lot of guts to stand up and do what he did. But at the same time, there are other people out there who would say, no, all he's doing is causing division. He's inciting hatred. Well, maybe not. I don't know. But it's very, very hard to cipher, to figure out what's really going on versus what things like fake news want you to think what's going on. And in today's world, it's getting harder every day to do that.
It sure is. I just about forgot to push the button down on my microphone there.
Oh, man. Now, so with Brexit, my gut feeling about it is it'll happen, the sky won't fall, and no matter what, because the British, say what you want about them, they're very resilient people. They have, if you look back in their history, they've been around 1,000 years. And they've seen this. They've seen things come and go that are better and worse than this. Everything from William the Conqueror to the Magna Carta, to the different fights they've been in and the ones they've chosen not to get into. So, will they survive this? Yeah, probably. If Hitler couldn't blast them off the map in 1940, I don't think Brexit is going to do them in either.
Who's going to be the prime minister? That's an important question as well, because I don't know that Theresa May survives.
I don't think she does.
If this deal doesn't get through Parliament.
And I don't know British politics well enough to know who would be an adequate or suitable replacement for her. I can't comment on that. I just don't know. I do hope that whoever it is has a spine of steel, because he or she is going to need it. There will be tremendous outcry by the anti-Brexit crowd, including the political allies in the House of Lords. So it's going to be very interesting over the next year and a half. They call the House of Lords, that's our House of Commons, right?
The House of Lords would be the equivalent of the Senate here in Canada.
Oh, okay.
So the House of Commons in Great Britain, we have a House of Commons here.
Okay,
they have a House of Commons.
I wasn't sure exactly how they squared up.
And here we have the Senate. There they have the Lords.
Okay.
Right.
Now I understand a little bit better.
You understand a little bit better?
Oh, yes. Yes. There's so much I don't understand, Joseph. Like, why do people park in the parkway and drive in a driveway? I don't get it.
Why
drive
do
in
people
a parkway and park in a driveway?
Park in a
driveway and drive in a parkway.
No, they park in a driveway and they drive in a parkway.
That's what I was trying to say, and it wasn't coming out very well.
I think it probably was.
Yeah, well, maybe.
Okay, so look, we're going to go for a break, and a couple of small technical details we have to iron out here, guys, so bear with us. Okay, welcome back to the Combat Zone. I'm Joe, he's Nick, and we had a couple of technical problems there, but we've got them sorted out now. So if you're joining us, let's pretend we're starting again for a second, okay? If you've been trying to leave us messages, etc., it's been going into the wrong location. So our sincere apologies, guys, but everything's fixed up live now, or fixed up properly now. So here's what you do. If you want to send us a message via our chat room, just click on that chat bubble in the live player. And if you have to register, if it asks you to register, if you haven't done that already, or if you have to sign in or register, costs you nothing. That's just to make sure that you're not a robot, that you're a real live human being. Or you could call us toll-free anywhere in North America, 844-415-2115. Again, that's 844-415-2115. And we just spent the last half hour chatting amongst ourselves about Brexit. But we're not going to go over that again. The show will be up live, if not tonight, then tomorrow sometime, not live, but the recording. And you can hear that exciting, stimulating, intelligent conversation,
brilliant,
between Nick and I about Brexit.
And trust me, Joe was absolutely brilliant. He absolutely nailed it, and I just sat here and just went,
Okay.
There was nothing to say. What am I supposed to say to that?
I know. Well, that's right. Well, we're legends in our own minds. Let's put it that way. Okay,
for sure. Nobody is a better legend in our own minds than we are.
Yeah, and or probably more appropriate to say we're myths in our own minds.
Could be.
And while we were on the topic of Brexit, okay, we really have to spend a few minutes talking about the GM, General Motors, closing a number of plants, or announcing that they're going to close a number of plants here in North America. And it's created a bit of a firestorm here. Not so much a firestorm here in Canada, but a real firestorm in the United States. President Trump, of course, is fighting mad about the announcement. And our own politicians here are upset about it as well. The union is calling on the governments to, both in the United States and in Canada, to step in to take measures to save the plants, punish GM, if you will. And so what do you have to say about all that, Nick?
Well, first of all, the thing that because like everybody else, first and foremost, you got to feel for the families who there's 20, I'll say 2,500 because it's somewhere in that range. About 2,500 people directly affected just lost some really good paying jobs a month before Christmas. That sucks. I don't care what anybody says.
But they haven't been laid off yet.
But they got the notice. So it's going to cast a pall.
Well, they know that it's going to happen sometime soon. But have they discussed any dates yet? I didn't hear any
within
dates.
the next year.
Okay, so
they
know that the plants are going to close,
right.
But they haven't received pink slips yet.
No, okay, maybe I came across wrong. What it does is it casts a shadow over everything they're going to do for the next year because now they're worried about how am I going to replace. Let's say they're making $75,000, $80,000 working for GM, which isn't unrealistic in today's world. If you've got any amount of seniority at all working in those plants, what I don't understand is how people thought this was a big surprise. Look, GM's job is not making cars or trucks or vehicles of any kind. Its job is to make money. It does that by making a product or providing a service that the consumer wants at a price that both sides can agree on. In this case, it happens to be the GMC Sierra, the Denali, the Impala, all these other cars. And they produce a good product. You say, yes, I like that, and I'm comfortable with the price, exchange, and in that exchange, that's where the profit comes from to keep the company in business. That's what every company does. Now, when you come along as a government and you start doing things like adding redundant environmental red tape to every move that any company does, the bigger the company, the bigger the impact. Yeah, well, they got the money. They can handle it. Yeah, they can, but why are you making them? Right? It's like, well, you got a bigger wheelbarrow here. Let's throw this bigger rock in there. Yeah, you can do that, but you know what? They get tired of it too. Then you have energy prices that are twice. Like in Indiana, which is a state we compete with, it has its own auto industry in that state. They pay 7 cents a kilowatt hour for hydro. Here in Ontario, GM was paying 14 cents, twice as much. Now, if you've ever been in any kind of heavy manufacturing facility, be it cars or anything else, they use a lot of power. So it's a huge cost to them. Then you start talking about carbon taxes. Then you start talking about environmental nonsense. And companies begin to say, well, if that's where the government's going to force the market, let's start developing product that's going to take advantage of those things. So they start going down roads they otherwise would not go. And then they finally get to the point when you say they hit them with something else coming down the pike. They look 5 years down the road because they plan this stuff does not happen overnight. They simply say 5 years from now, how tenable is it going to be? Because you've got labor costs are always rising, energy prices are still really high, all this kind of stuff. Are we going to be able to make a decent return on our investment here? And if the answer is no, they're going to close the plant, and there's nothing the unions or the government can or should do about it. Okay. Other than reduce the cost of doing business.
Okay, so everybody knows that I am a free marketer.
So, absolutely.
Okay, yeah. I loathe the idea of government interfering in private business. I guess my problem in this situation is that the government, in fact, already has been interfering. Let's not forget that GM was on the verge of bankruptcy. They went into bankruptcy protection in 2008, 2009, or whatever it was.
Yeah. Too big to fail.
And they were essentially bailed out by the government, by taxpayers. And in addition to that, you know, there are certain benefits that they have derived from taxpayers, reduced taxes, different deals. I generally, no pun intended, I agree with you, Nick. I think the government shouldn't interfere. I think that these guys, the leaders of General Motors, as with all businesses, they make the best decisions that they can make in the circumstances for the shareholders. And let's not forget that GM is not a private industry. GM and these the shareholders are, largely speaking, mutual fund holders.
Yeah.
Retirees.
All of that's true.
Okay, so I don't know. I don't know. I'm really torn about this because I have to say this. I don't think the government should step in to save them, and I don't think the government should step in to help. I feel bad for the workers, but I guess what I understand the anger. I understand the anger because while I disagreed with the government providing a bailout essentially for these guys 10 years ago, okay, they did. Whether I like it or not, they did. And one would expect that the owners, that the management team at General Motors would feel some kind of an obligation to sit down with government in advance of making a decision and to say to them, this is what we're considering. We have to find a way to make this work. And I know it sounds like I'm going against my idea, my principle here that the government shouldn't interfere in private industry. I get all of that, but surely to goodness there's some kind of a quid pro quo. Look, here's the thing, okay? Fine, close your plant. Can we have our money back, please?
I'm all for that.
Can we have our money back, please?
I don't think
give us our money back.
I think they've paid a bulk of it, the bulk of it back, but they still owe us. I think the last number I saw was about $1.2 billion.
I don't know,
and that's still not small. That's not chicken feed.
But it's not just the money. Okay, there was a certain investment in time, and I don't know. I'm not articulating it very well, but I really do. I understand the people around this, both in government and the workers, who feel betrayed.
Understand?
I really do. I understand that, and I don't know how you punish, if that's the right word.
I think
General Motors.
Let me float this idea because I hear you, and I don't want GM to leave either. Okay, I would prefer that they stay. They are a huge part of our automotive industry, which is a huge part of our economy. There's no denying that the car is king, and it has been king for a very long time. And no matter what Justin Trudeau has to say, it's going to be king for quite a while yet. So the point is, if you went to GM, nobody's even talking about this, but what about if they went to GM and said, look, we're going to make sure, if Trudeau was serious about saving jobs, not just here in Ontario, but what about Alberta? I'd be interested. I can't wait to hear what Roy Beyer has to say about this when he comes up at 10 o'clock. But to have him go and seriously say, look, at the very least, we're going to put our carbon tax plan on hold. We're not going to impose a carbon tax plan for the next 5 years.
I knew we were going to have to talk carbon taxes, right?
Of course.
But you see, that's the kind of, I'm against the carbon tax, Nick, okay, 100%. I'm against anything to do with creating some kind of artificial price structure around carbon, okay, whether it's directly through taxation or it's indirectly through regulation or whatever, okay? So on this one, I think that the Conservatives and the Liberals are all wrong, okay?
Okay.
Okay, great. But what you're arguing for, in principle here, is the government changing policy in order to help a particular industry or reacting to an industry.
The reason I want them to change it isn't just because it's bad for industry. It's bad for everybody. It's a bad plan.
Okay, but it's not going to make a difference to these guys.
Well, that's not the end of the package.
But you see, you're talking about this as like the language of a package. These guys are threatening to close. And by the way, I have to tell you this. I'm not entirely convinced that they're ready to close. This could just be an opening negotiation ploy for them to try to wring more benefits out of taxpayers in one form or another.
It wouldn't be the first time we see that happen.
It absolutely wouldn't. If it had been me, I would have let them fail back 10 years ago.
Well, you could also look at companies like Bombardier.
Because the truth is, when they were talking about this 10 years ago, they kept on saying, well, man, these guys are going to go they're going to GM or Chrysler, these guys are going to go out of business, and then what's going to happen? All of a sudden, the notion was, the logic was that by these guys going out of business, all of a sudden there wasn't going to be a market anymore for cars, okay? That nobody was going to, suddenly we were going to stop producing cars. And I'm going, no, people are still going to buy as many cars as they were buying before. So if there's a market for cars, then if GM goes, the way of the dodo bird, okay, then let it go and let the other companies step in and take over the market and expand their operations, because they're clearly doing something better than GM is doing. Or, Nissan is doing something better than Chrysler is doing. And that's the whole idea, is you have better competition, and in the end, workers are treated better as well. Now, that's on a macro scale. On a local scale, on a micro scale, if you will, yes, it's true. Individual workers are going to be dislocated. They're going to suffer. People are going to be out of a job, and it's unfortunate. But that's the way it goes, okay? I don't mean to sound unfeeling or uncaring, but that's the way it goes.
That happens in every industry.
Okay?
Go back 100 years.
But from a macroeconomic point of view, these guys should have been allowed to fail 10 years ago. We bailed them out, and whether there was a written agreement or not, there was at least a tacit understanding that they're going to be there for the community. Now, again, I know it sounds like I'm speaking out of both sides of my mouth here, because generally I don't think that this is something that we should be forcing industry to do. But look, if you're going to take handouts from taxpayers, then that creates certain obligations above and beyond just the letter of the law. And I'm saying this, okay? If they're saying we're going to shut down, and if they come to us now and they say to us, we want to have some sort of concessions from the government. Okay, we'll keep the plant open, but we want you guys have to waive property taxes for 10 years, or you have to do like Amazon, what they just did to get a deal in New York City.
Right.
Okay, they had to have the city, and I believe the state, but certainly the city, waive a whole pile of fees that other businesses have to pay. And if I'm a small business owner and Amazon comes in, I mean, I understand the whole idea of employment and that, but surely to goodness, if the idea is you want to get people working, and people who work pay taxes, okay, then why wouldn't you offer tax incentives to everybody? But no, you offer it to Amazon, and then a company the size of Amazon said they basically blackmail you to say, well, we're not going to locate in your community unless you give us a tax break. If that's what GM does now, okay, and this is what I'm really concerned about, is that the politicians now, under pressure from various sources, are lining up, Nick, and they're saying, what do we have to do to make you stay? What do we have to do to make you stay? And it wouldn't surprise me in the least to discover that that's just the kind of reaction that these guys at GM are waiting for. And I say this, if they come now and they say, okay, we'll keep our plants open, but you have to do X, Y, and Z to help us keep it open, I say let them go. There you go.
Yep. I'm not arguing with you.
I didn't even have to rehearse that, by the way.
No, that was really well done. Good monologue. The part of it that drives me crazy is that it's this culture that we've allowed to develop over several decades that is poisoning the business community. There's a reason why companies do leave. Like, where did Caterpillar go in London? What happened to Heinz? I mean, you run Kellogg's Cornflakes. You run down the list, and it gets longer all the time. Now there's a good chance you could add GM to that list. So what is it causing these companies to leave? And again, it comes back to the bad policies by different governments at different levels surrounding things like environment, surrounding things like climate change that have a direct impact on the cost of manufacturing here in Ontario or here in Canada at large. And that's what we need to change. We need to Doug Ford says the province is open for business, but does that mean he's gotten a handle on power rates? Does that mean that he's cut a lot of the red tape. Does that mean that, that he's going to do everything he can to make sure we don't end up with that carbon tax? How is it that things have changed? I'm waiting to see. Because unless he actually goes out and finds a way to get these things done, then nothing has changed and no one will come. Yeah, that's the whole point. There's a reason people move to Mexico, China, because it doesn't cost them nearly the same amount of money to produce the same product that we still buy. And you're right, we'll still buy them.
Okay, so this is, my bottom line is this, okay? Whatever incentives that you are going to offer GM to keep those plants open, the reason that you offer an incentive to keep the plant open is because the things that you're doing that they want you to stop doing are a disincentive. So remove them. But if you're going to remove these things from GM, then remove them from all the other industries as well.
That's what
and let the private sector flourish. I don't want to see GM treated any differently than any other industry in the province. And anyway, enough said. I went on a rant here.
And
I'm speaking, and I know I'm speaking out of both sides of my mouth on this a little bit, but I'm a little upset about it. I understand, the GM. We invested money. Okay, the money was paid back. I get all of that. Okay, but you know what? If I'm a mom and pop shop on the corner store, in Bancroft, Ontario, and I'm having problems, and I've got 5 or 6 employees, and I'm on the verge of bankruptcy for whatever reason, okay, guess what? Government is not rushing to my aid to bail me out.
Well, they won't
okay, they're not going to go, if I'm behind on my taxes, they're not going to come to me and say, that's okay, we'll waive your taxes because we know that your times are tough for you, and after all, you employ 5 people. Right?
Well, if they're not going to bail out the Alberta oil patch, they're not going to bail out a mom and pop grocery store.
Well, and that's my problem. That's what I'm saying.
So that's why I'm very interested to hear what Roy has to say. I'm trying to stay out of the oil patch because I don't want to steal his thunder, but I'll be very interested to hear what a Western perspective is in all this. And I agree with you about treating all businesses equally. I just think we have to stop poisoning the well for business in general here in Canada, through the different means that I've already mentioned. If we're going to be open for business, to use Doug Ford's phrase, then we need to be serious about it. We need to allow companies to come in and expand and regain our competitive edge so that it's a place that's going to provide a decent return for their investment dollar. That's the only way we're going to get back anything that we used to have. And I don't know if it's possible to get back to where we were 20, 30 years ago. Like, how do you bring back Stefasco? How do you bring back, what's that big aluminum company, Alcor? They might still be around, but they're a shadow of their former selves. What do you do with all the paper mills and so on that are closed because of high energy? The smelter in Timmins, how do you bring that back? You
don't.
That's the point.
You don't.
So those jobs are lost forever. But we have to start opening the doors to innovation, creativity, heavy construction, heavy industry, all the things that provide real good jobs, and let the market look after itself. That's what we got to do.
Okay, GM.
That was... Now, people have to also remember that GM is a private company and do what they want. If they want to close a plant, there's nothing the province or the state can do about it.
Sure, I understand that. I'm not.
You wouldn't know it listening to the news.
Well, yeah. Well, is there any such thing as private industry in this country nowadays? I don't. That's more than just a rhetorical question. I mean, really. Yeah. I'm just a little ticked. I feel for those guys in Oshawa. But by the way, GM is nowhere near as big in Oshawa as they were at one point in time. So, I guess that's a bit of a sort of call it a macro consolation, if you will.
If a business, like there's been millions of businesses that have gone out of business that used to be huge. My favorite example is the old Loken bucket business. They were, everybody needed a bucket. we had an agrarian society. You drew your water from a well, had to have a way to something to put the water in, so they made these buckets out of oak. Until the day they invented the steel pail. And all of a sudden, the old oak and bucket company was on life support, and then it died. Another classic example is the Telegraph versus the Pony Express. The Pony Express carried the mail across the continent for about 30 or 40 years until they strung the first telegraph wire, and 3 weeks later it was dead because technology passed them by. That's been a feature of business and commerce for as long as we've had business and commerce. Companies come, companies go, people get laid off, people get hired, and this, if that had happened in a natural free market, then okay, because eventually we will evolve beyond the car, or we will evolve to something that you wouldn't recognize as a car. They're now playing around with flying cars. I mentioned this before. They had a test just this week up in not Uplands, a little airport, Buttonville Airport near Toronto, where they flew the first autonomous car by itself. Took off, landed, floated around.
Yeah, Nick, you can't wait.
You're right, I can't wait. I'm excited about it. But the point I'm making is that's the future.
Right. I'll be happy when I get my driverless car.
You can have.
I don't want a pilotless car.
I
think that's a recipe for disaster. But in fairness, okay, and I don't know that we pay enough attention to this, and I don't know what the role of government is in this, but those examples that you cited, Nick, of the Pony Express versus the Telegraph, or the wooden oaken bucket versus the steel bucket, all of those are great examples, and they illustrate an important point. But I think it's also important to remember that workers back in those days did not require the kind of specialized training to move from one job to another that they do today. So it's harder. I think it's harder on workers today than it was 100 or 200, perhaps any other time in history, to move from one job to another job. Is there a role for government to play in retraining? Perhaps. And of course, that's a whole different story about, how government regulation actually impedes the training, especially in the trades of new workers or people moving from one trade to another trade. And we've talked about that. We had Walter Pamick on a couple of months ago, and he was explaining some of the problems in his industry, the electrical industry here in Ontario. So, government regulation largely undermines that, but even without government regulation undermining the whole area of retraining, I think that it's fair to say that today it's much harder. Those guys who have training, have been working on the line for 30 years at GM, where do they go? Well, and how do we help them to find new jobs,
It's the same story as when the fisheries collapsed out east. And you had guys 45, 50 years old. All they'd ever done is bob around in a dory fishing for cod.
Right.
What are they going to do when they close down what did they do when they closed down the fisheries? It's supposed to be for 2 years. It's only coming back now, and it had nothing. There was two factors that actually they figured out what the problem was. One was the trawlers that came along with big scoops and just took everything. And the other one was the water temperature changed a little bit and the cod moved. Right. So where you were fishing before,
whatever the cause.
Yeah, the bottom line is these guys had 35, 40, 50 years experience, some of them, doing one thing. And that experience went back hundreds of years because that's what their daddy did, and that's what their great-granddaddy did, and that's what their great-granddaddy did. But once it dried up, the kids all said, what's for me, and they went to Toronto.
Well, not all of them went to Toronto. And
a good bunch of them did.
But it's tough. It's tough, which, and again, I guess I don't want to sound unsympathetic, but my father came to this country in 1952. He left Europe, came here to make a better life for himself, and I guess it's easy for me to say, but I guess if my father could do that, then other people, including myself, if I was facing the same situation, can travel from one part of the country to the other in search of work. But that doesn't change the underlying problem of providing training for people who need the training, because you could go from a labor-intensive, just a labor job in Cape Breton to a labor job in Toronto. You could go from working on a fish trawler to just being a general laborer on the construction site in Toronto. It's a lot harder when you need that kind of technical training to get into computers or automation. And the auto industry today is largely computerized. It's largely automated.
Yeah.
So, you don't just have guys that are putting rivets into the sheet metal. You know what I'm saying?
This isn't just putting spark plugs in on the line anymore. I understand that. I think what needs to be recognized, too, is that there are a lot of industries out there now who are willing to provide in-house training because they're so hard to find people with experience in the right fields.
Right.
So that's a feature, too, that shouldn't be discounted.
Okay, it's top of the hour. We're going to go for a bit of a break. We'll catch you on the other side.
Okay, welcome back to the Combat Zone, folks. We have coming up in just a moment Roy Beyer. He's our Western correspondent, and he'll have lots to say about the economy and about oil prices and visits by prime ministers and all kinds of things about what's going on out west, because this show has a national and an international flavor, and we like to pay attention to our cousins our brothers and sisters in the West. There he is. Hey, Roy. It's been a little while since we chatted with you last. We thought you'd bring you in. So let me ask you, just to put into perspective for the listeners who don't live in Alberta, how big a problem really is this? Like when we talk about, the death of the oil industry or the decline, what kind of numbers are we talking about?
Well, a few things I want to comment on is that, number one, we've already lost about 100,000 jobs. Now, I know you in Ontario, you just heard about the GM plant closure there in Oshawa, and we do feel for the people of Oshawa. We know it's terrible when that happens, but just multiply that in terms of per capita by 100, okay? That's what Alberta is feeling in terms of job losses already. And that's nothing compared to what we're going to experience in the next 12 months if things don't change. And I'm not overstating it. I'm stating 100,000 job losses in a province of 4 million people, and we're about to see another 100,000 or more job losses in this province, or I should say Alberta, Saskatchewan, because Saskatchewan is also a very big part of this. And keep in mind, we're not talking about Alberta, Saskatchewan. We're talking about Canada. Alberta is by far the most important contributor to be able to the transfer program as
right.
far as the monies that come from Alberta, Saskatchewan that go to the rest of the country to help with the equality of making sure that people are getting in every part of the country kind of equal treatment in terms of taxes and benefits. But this transfer program is going to come to an end within a year or two. Alberta will no longer be a have province. It will become a have-not province. And if you don't believe that, just watch it happen. Just watch it happen. It's unbelievable to me. We have a Prime Minister of Canada who is looking at the crisis in Alberta and not coming through with a solution. Still sticking with Bill C-69, which will absolutely be like a death knell to Alberta. It will be a death knell, like absolutely. And the only response Alberta is left with is, accept our economic engine being destroyed, or decide to leave Canada. And that's really what's at stake. And that's why Jason Kenney, the leader of the Conservative Party, United Conservative Party, has decided to put out a proposal that's kind of counterintuitive for conservatives, but at least something that the NDP can say, yes, let's look at it, to try and address the crisis short term, because without addressing the crisis short term, we're going to have a really deep economic crisis here in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and it will be something that will have permanent damage to our economy across Canada. So it's frustrating because the media is not covering it. Globe and Mail and CBC and the rest of them are absolutely not covering the crisis, but it's something that people need to be aware of.
Well, let me ask you, because the last I heard from Notley in the news, they were talking about a midterm solution by putting more rolling stock, more tankers on the rails. The first thing that occurred to me was that, well, okay, that's better than nothing, but do you actually have the track capacity to accept? Because let's face it, there's only so much track in Canada, and you only have so many tankers. Have they got the room to put enough tankers on rail, rolling stock, to be able to hold the line at least and keep Alberta going until we can get something done with Trans Mountain or some of these other pipelines that need to be built?
Great question, Nick. And first of all, the Notley proposal for additional rail capacity, I mean, it's welcome, but it makes no sense from an environmental perspective. You have to kind of keep in mind the picture. I mean, as Western Canadians, we know, geographically kind of where the rail lines go. They follow along rivers and streams and environmentally sensitive areas. And instead of a relatively safe way of shipping oil by way of pipeline, the idea that Notley and others have is we'll alternatively ship with rail is crazy. We all know that there's a derailments. And when there's a derailment, I mean, if it happens in a city or community, I mean, it's with involving petroleum products, you have extremely huge consequences.
Well,
environmentally.
Look at what happened in Lac Mégantic in Quebec.
Oh, you don't have to look very far to find examples of what he's talking about.
Yeah, you don't have to look far at all. And, of course, all of these railways follow along the Bow River, for example, here in Alberta, the Fraser River, the Thompson River in BC. So all these railway lines that have these tanker cars with oil are far more potentially problematic environmentally than a pipeline would be. And keep in mind, the pipeline regulations to build a pipeline in Canada is the highest standard in the world. The highest standard in the world, and that's not good enough, right? So instead, we're going to ship it by rail. So that's craziness, but that's what Notley's proposal is asking for, is for the government to subsidize additional rail cars that can ship oil, and then run those rail cars along the tracks along rivers, and that's an alternative to pipelines. So that's insanity gone to seed. Right?
Okay.
It's stupidity, really is. And so, but that's not the only thing. Jason Kenney announced, actually, I think today or yesterday, I can't remember, but Jason Kenney announced a proposal by which that all of the oil companies will agree to a reduction of production in order to try and achieve a higher price per barrel of oil for Canada oil. So right now, as of yesterday, by the way, the world price of oil was about $55 a barrel U.S., and Canada was getting about $12 per barrel.
Now, Roy, can you go into a little bit, explain why that is, why the price differential?
Because if you're an oil company in Canada, you have to sell your oil. You have to take into account your ability to ship the oil. So if you don't have the ability to ship the oil, you have to provide a discount. And so there's a discount of about $40 per barrel for Canadian producers as of right now. So it's between $20 and $40, $25 and $40 per barrel I mean, we're talking about all this oil we have in Canada. second highest, and some people would say the highest reserve amount in the world, Canada. And we can't ship our oil to China. We can't ship our oil to Malaysia, to Indonesia, to anywhere else because there's no pipeline to the coast. So we have no alternative but to ship the oil by rail. If you're shipping the oil by rail, the shortest line is to USA. So the USA is picking up our oil at $12 per barrel yesterday.
Okay, so
$12.
That's insane. That's
And
you can't.
think about that. How crazy is that? $12 per barrel for oil, for Canadian oil, because we have this huge glut of oil and we can't get it out. So that's why Jason Kennedy is saying, okay, let's agree to reduce the amount of oil we release into the marketplace so that hopefully we can recover some of what we're losing. But we have an opportunity to ship the oil to all these other countries that are looking for oil, but we have no capacity to do that because our rail lines are limited. There's no pipeline capacity. Pipelines are by far the most efficient way to do that. And the Trudeau government, Junior Trudeau, has done everything he can to stop any pipeline from being built in this country. That's the reason for, as in answer to your question, Joseph, for this crisis. We can't get our oil out, and we have a glut. And so whoever is willing to take our oil, the glut, as low as $12 a barrel yesterday, is what we're selling our oil for here in Canada.
Now, one of the things I'm curious about is because when you're just coming into the drilling season now, true?
Yeah, but it's so irrelevant. You have no idea how relevant that is. Like the drilling season used to be something that we always talked about. You know, what kind of drilling, what kind of level of drilling will take place this next year. The answer is very little.
Yeah,
you have to understand that you have the top oil companies in Canada, Canadian companies like Cenovus in Canada, other companies that are absolutely moving all of their investments into the U.S. because, I mean, think about it. Would you drill for oil in Canada knowing you're going to get $12 or $14 or $15 a barrel versus drilling in the U.S. knowing you're going to get $50 or $60 a barrel?
Oh, there's no. It's ridiculous. Of course, there's no that, but that's not where.
But that's the problem. Like, there's not going to be any drilling. It has nothing to do with world oil prices. It has something to do with whether we can ship our oil. If you can't ship your oil, you're not going to drill in Canada. You're going to drill in the U.S.
Okay, but where I was going with this,
brag about being the number one country in the world. President Trump is bragging about it because even Canadian companies are drilling in the U.S. versus Canada because of the craziness of Trudeau not allowing us to build the pipelines.
Okay, no argument with any of that, but that's not quite where I was going with that. When I was talking about going into the drilling season, used to be, as I understood the numbers that I read, they would spend about $11 billion a year in good times searching out new reserves, drilling new oil wells, those kinds of things. That has dropped by 90% for all the reasons that you just articulated. That alone should send off warning bells. And yet, for some reason, we have a government who simply refuses. Rachel Notley couldn't even get an appointment with the Prime Minister today. Now, I don't like Notley.
Yeah.
There's no secret of that. But look, when you have the premier of one of your most economically important provinces, nothing against Prince Edward Island, but it ain't Prince Edward Island. You know, when they come knocking on your door, you should at least extend them the courtesy of opening it and listening to what they have to say. But he was too busy talking about protecting French language rights here in Ontario. Now, which one on the scale of, importance would you put your weight on? So this is, I think, part of the reason why people, and not just in Alberta, there is a growing understanding. Like, it's not just the bloom is off the rose. I think that Mr. Trudeau is doing himself tremendous damage for the next election, and he's counting on all kinds of witchcraft and counting on all kinds of votes coming in from immigrants and so on to try to save his bacon, because he's a lot of things. Well, he's a lot of things. Let's put it that way. Now, I wanted to find out, too, if you explained why the price of gas, what does it mean in Alberta in real terms? I mean, you just had 100,000, I think the number is 120,000 jobs lost. So if you've got towns like Edmonton, Calgary, Fort Mac, places like that out there, what kind of impact does that have on the local level when you lose that level of employment?
Well, if you were to imagine in Ontario job losses of about 400,000 people, then you would understand the impact on Alberta. And if you were to imagine a government that refused to take action that would result in another $400,000 job losses in Ontario, that's what we're facing in Alberta. So the 100,000 job loss is in the context of oil prices being in $50 to $70 a barrel worldwide. So $50 to $70 per barrel worldwide is kind of ideal, because it would mean that your oil price, your gasoline prices for, kind of filling up your car would still be reasonable, and the profit margin for the oil company is still very good. But not in Alberta, not in Saskatchewan, not anywhere in Canada. The fact is our profit margins in Canada are such that you're insane to reinvest into Canada. What you need to do is take all of your money and move it into the USA or in other places around the world. So that is the reality. So, I'm trying to help people in Ontario to understand the context. We are brothers and sisters in this great, Canada, dominion from sea to sea. And I'm telling you right now that a lot of Albertans feel like, the only hope, the sense of hope we have is that we look at the Ford government in Ontario and say, wow, that's a good government. And they seem to be really aware of what's happening in Alberta, and they do care. But when you look at Trudeau and his actions, you have to look at that and say, well, if people reelect Trudeau, I believe it's going to result in a very, very quick response in Canada, in Alberta, of wanting to just leave Canada, because that's how serious it is. And I'm not overstating it, because I'm very pro-Canadian. You have to understand, I'm very pro-Canadian. I remember very specifically when Preston Manning was pushing hard to start his Reform Party, and Deborah Gray was the only member of Parliament. And I remember almost to the day, the moment I became a reformer. And that was the day when Mulroney decided to side with Quebec versus Manitoba for the F-18 contract. Now, for Ontarians and Quebecers, they said, what's the big deal? For us in Alberta, was like a clear picture that no matter what happens, Quebec, Ontario will always be preferred over the rest of Canada. And that's when I became a reformer. And not just me, hundreds of thousands of people in Western Canada decided. And it happened overnight. And I'm telling you, it happened overnight. It's not emotional, it's logical. Overnight, logically, people said, we have to switch to reform. It's the only way we can change things in Canada. And I'm saying right now, the mood is similar in Alberta and Saskatchewan, both provinces, where the sentiment is we're looking for some hope that Canada will actually care about what's happening here in the West, because we are being damaged in such a severe way, right? And it's so obvious. It's so ridiculous. Like C-69 is a bill right before Parliament right now, technically before the Senate, and it will absolutely stop dead in its track any possibility of any pipeline ever being built in Canada. And the only logical response for us in Alberta is you have to defend the province, right? You have to defend our ability to make a living. And the sentiment is there. So I want to just say, like, if most Albertans believe in Canada, But there's a point in time where they say, you know what, we've had enough. And right now, there's a loss of revenue of over $100 million per day. $100 million per day because of no pipelines. And we don't want sentiment. We don't want, little nice excuses from the Prime Minister. We need a pipeline built really, really fast. The rail proposal of Notley is wonderful. It's step one. It's temporary, it's short term. We need pipelines. The pipeline to Eastern Canada needs to be built. The pipeline to BC needs to be built. And we need to get our oil outside of our country as quickly as possible, because right now we're selling our oil to the United States at between $15 and $20 per barrel. Write it down. Think about it. Does that make any sense for anyone in Canada? We need to fix this problem.
So if I understand this correctly, you're not looking for bailouts. You're not looking for handouts. You're looking for the government to get out of your way.
The government actually needs to, it's technically the other way around. The government is in the way of building a pipeline. The pipeline proposal we have to BC is the highest standard from a pure environmental perspective, the highest standard in the world. The safest pipeline in the world, and it's not good enough. If you're looking as an oil company, say, if Canada has the highest standard in the world, and even that is not good enough, it's being blocked, the Prime Minister should have immediately, when one judge said no to the pipeline, should have immediately, asked for that decision to be appealed. He didn't.
No, I remember that quite well. And this
didn't do that. It sits there as a decision that keeps us from building a pipeline so we can get oil, Alberta oil, to China, Malaysia, Japan, and other countries that want it. So because of that, we're now experiencing a $100 million per day loss in revenue as Canadians. And that's a huge loss. It's going to affect everyone in Canada. It's going to affect everyone in Ontario, everyone in Quebec. And if you were to imagine if some Canadian steel company in Ontario, Quebec, had to face the prospect of getting 1/4 of the world price for your steel because you couldn't ship it, and a government that wouldn't allow a solution, right? A government that would not allow a solution, what would your reaction be?
Yeah.
It's not hard to imagine.
No,
so, this is perfection, except for Alberta. Oil is it's the number one component of our economy, as it is in Saskatchewan.
Well, we're coming up on a break, Roy. It'll be we've only got about another minute or two before we take the break. But one of the things that occurs to me is that it's very much like a marriage, and one half of the marriage is being abused, and the other one has been putting up with it for years. You're right. Sooner or later, you've had enough, and you have to walk away from it. I've always been far more worried about Alberta and the West separating than I ever was about Quebec, because Quebec needs us. Alberta and the West don't. And that's the part I think that's really important to understand when you look at this, because let's face it, if you guys were actually and I don't want to see this happen ever, but if you did, it wouldn't take you long to get back on your feet without those regulations in there.
Okay, let's go for a break. Hold. Will you stick with us there, Roy? Stick with us. Yeah. We'll be back in a minute. Okay, Roy? Stick with us.
All right, welcome back to the Combat Zone, folks. My name's Joe. He's Nick. Had to do it once. I'm Nick. He's Joe. And on the line with us.
You did that on purpose?
Of course I did.
I don't believe you.
And on the line with us is our Western correspondent, who's been doing an admirable job this evening putting up with us, is Roy Beyer from, are you in Calgary or Edmonton?
Calgary, but I love Edmonton as well, which is, I'm one of the few Albertans that love both cities.
Wow, you are a strange duck. Congratulations on that amazing football game, though. The Grey Cup was a lot of fun to watch this year.
Yeah, it was, and I won't say too much about most Albertans. You know what? Actually, I watched it in Edmonton. I was there live, and there was an odd number of Edmontonians that were cheering for Ottawa.
Oh,
so
man. That's funny because I was cheering for Calgary.
Yeah, you know what? I think the rivalry between Edmonton and Calgary is a little more intense than I expected when you have Edmontonians actually cheering for Ontario, or for Ottawa. I thought that was rather odd, but anyway, yeah, it was a great game. Most interesting for me was the flyover by the Snowbirds,
yep.
and the great halftime show. I find football games are easier and more fun to watch live on TV than in person. As everything looks so small, you can't see what's going on. And I said, well, it's fun to be with the crowd, but it's more interesting to watch when you're on television. But it's probably not something I should be saying. Yeah, it's also warmer, but you see the replays, you see the close-ups, you see everything much, much better. So I love football, and yeah, it was great to be there. And like I said, it's one of those once-a-year events with the Grey Cup, and this year I was able to get and take that in person, so it was great.
All right. Well, next year it'll be us against you guys, but us will be the Tiger Cats.
It'll be the Calgarians to get to host the event, and
they'll play the Tiger Cats.
I'm an Edmonton Eskimo fan, so I'm hoping it'll be Edmonton. And if you want the Ticats, that sounds great. So let's go for that.
Just grab a horse, find a hotel, ride it through the lobby.
Yes. Yeah.
No, that only works. That only works in the Royal York Hotel.
Oh no, they do that. As a matter of fact, during the 100th anniversary Grey Cup, that took place in 1949. A bunch of Calgarians came from out west on a train, brought their horses, rode them all over town through the Royal York Hotel, and then 6 years ago when they did it, they went back to the Royal York. The Royal York turned them down. No, it was here in Ottawa. Was the 100th here in Ottawa? It doesn't matter. Whatever city was in, they went to the main hotel in that city.
Well, I don't remember them riding horses here in Ottawa. Not recently, anyway.
Maybe it was Toronto. But anyway, the point was they went back to that hotel, and they got turned down. They wouldn't let them ride through. But they got so many requests from all the other major hotels in town to come and ride the horse through theirs that they finally relented and let them go through the original one. And it was kind of nice. A lot of fun. Anyway, all right.
Back to the
football all night.
Back to the topic at hand.
That's right. I'm just curious. You mentioned Jason Kenney's reduction. For the layman, it sounds pretty straightforward. But what exactly did he propose?
A reduction of production in the West, and I don't know specifically if it's Alberta and Saskatchewan or just Alberta, but let's assume it's Alberta only. Reducing production, that the oil companies would reduce production. Exemptions would be for small companies, startups, that kind of thing, because they rely on cash flow more than bigger companies. And trying to reduce the production so that by having less production, we'd have less oil available and hopefully get the price closer to $20 per barrel below world prices instead of what we have now, around between 30 and 40. So that's his proposal, which, as a conservative, I'm assuming Jason Kenney is very conservative in terms of his economic philosophy, would be counterintuitive, but it kind of tells you how serious the crisis is. So as a temporary solution, reducing production in Alberta to try to get better prices on our per barrel oil. And of course, Notley's proposal is to add into that, Rachel Notley, to add some additional purchase of rail cars that can carry oil. and so we can carry more oil to the coast and export it that way.
Now, I'm not an expert. I'm not an expert on the law here, but is it possible that that kind of price fixing is illegal in Canada?
I'm not an expert either, Joseph. I think that this proposal came out of desperation as being, and I think it's probably voluntary. Is kind of how I interpreted what was being said by Jason Kenney, is that it would be a voluntary, because he said some companies said no. So I assume that it's voluntary. And if you're producing oil and selling it at 15 or like yesterday $12 a barrel, you're probably thinking this is insanity, and it might make sense to most people to say, yeah, let's cut production. So it's probably voluntary, and if it's voluntary, it probably is constitutional. But I'm not an expert. It's a state of desperation where
right.
Any solution is better than leaving it the way it is, because if we leave it the way it is,
right. I understand. I'm not arguing. I'm not arguing against it. It just sounds so odd for us to be talking about, what essentially is a price fixing scheme. But I understand the desperation that it's born of.
Yeah, I think it's artificial price fixing. I guess that's what you're looking at, and that's why I say it's counterintuitive for somebody like Jason Kenney. But Jason has been very, very sincere in his efforts to try to find short-term and longer-term solutions, and working, even if it means working with Rachel Notley, like, let's do something together as Albertans to try to address the crisis. It is that serious, and again, I'm not overstating it. 100,000 job losses here in Alberta is equivalent to 400,000 job losses in Ontario, or 300,000 job losses in Quebec. So that gives you perspective, and that's nothing compared to what we'll face if we don't change things.
I will say that it sounds to me like this whole plan is kind of cut from the cloth that says easier to ask forgiveness than permission. In other words, illegal or not, they'll go ahead and do it and then worry about the consequences later, because you're right. It is that serious. This is not something they're taking lightly, and you don't suggest these kinds of things unless you feel like you have no other alternative.
No, no question. And I'm quite sure Jason Kenney has worked it through to whatever the detail of his proposal. As I understand it, it's a voluntary cutback, so I don't believe it's illegal. It's just, if you have all this oil to sell to the world that has a growing demand for oil, and you can't sell it, again, liken it to having a glut of hydroelectricity in Quebec, or a glut of cars in Ontario or steel, and saying, the whole world wants it, but your own government is keeping you from getting it out. Your own government. That's what's happening. And so it's not like the world is saying no to our oil. It's Ottawa. It's specifically the Trudeau Liberals that are saying no to allowing us to ship our oil. And if that were to happen to the Ontario auto industry or to the Quebec hydro industry, Albertans would say that's crazy. And I hope that right now Quebecers and Ontarians will agree with me today and say, this is crazy. It's got to stop. We have to stop C-69, and we have to push the government of this country to build a pipeline, and build pipelines, actually, so we can get our Canadian oil out to the rest of the world.
Well, one of the things that's stopping you is Bill C-69. Do you have, just again for the layperson who doesn't understand, the minutia of this, just kind of spell it out what that law actually says? How you say it would absolutely kill any future pipeline, and just would just devastate the Western economy. What are the features of it that would do that? Roy? Did we lose Roy?
That's a good question. I don't know. We're just going to check this out here. And let's see.
Hi.
There he
Hey,
is.
Roy, did we lose you there?
We lost me there somehow.
Okay,
some
did
way.
that question of mine make any sense at all?
Ask me the question again.
Okay, I was just basically asking you to kind of lay out in simple terms what it is about Bill 69 that is so devastating. Because let's face it, most people, they don't read legislation. I'm not suggesting that you're a lawyer and you do either, but you have a much closer relationship with that bill than the rest of the country does. So what makes it so onerous?
Well, first of all, as it is, it's taking 10 to 15 years for a company to build a pipeline in a situation where environmentalists are opposing it, right? So 10 to 15 years, we have the highest standards in the world. Bill C-69 is making that even more onerous. So we already have the highest standards in the world, and it becomes even higher. So the practical interpretation for every oil company in the country that has any credibility is, in practical terms, if Bill C-69 is passed, you will never build another pipeline of substance in this country. And I'm talking about pipelines that involve moving Alberta oil for export, whether it's to Eastern Canada, so we can build refineries in Eastern Canada, so we can stop using Saudi Arabia oil and use Alberta oil instead. That'll never happen with Bill C-69. It'll never happen that we can build a pipeline to BC so it can ship to China or Indonesia. And, so people say, well, you're overstating it. I'm saying, look, every credible voice in the oil industry interprets it the same way. So if I'm overstating it, maybe I am. But maybe the fact is that every oil company is interpreting Bill C-69 as it's impossible to build a pipeline in Canada. So if I have $2 or $3 billion to invest on a pipeline, am I going to build it in Canada or am I going to build it in the U.S.?
Yeah, it doesn't take a rocket science to figure that
Bottom
out.
line, the world. We're living in a real world. And perception is reality. And when Canada sets such a high standard that every oil company in the world looks at it and says, crazy, you'll never get a pipeline in Canada. All the money's going to move elsewhere. And when I say all, I mean Canadian money, not just Shell and Exxon and other companies that are based in other countries. I'm talking about Canadian-based companies moving their money from Canada into other places. Because bottom line is, if you have a few $1 billion to invest on a pipeline, you would never do so in Canada because the Bill C-69 is so onerous, it's virtually impossible to ever build a pipeline in this country if that bill passes.
Now, one of the things you mentioned earlier on in the first part of your conversation with us this evening was the dishonesty of the press. You were talking about the protest. There's been a lot of talk about the protest out west. And CBC, the one report I did see on it, said there's about 1,000 people protesting. I don't know if you were part of that protest or know which one I'm talking about. Maybe there was more than one. Bring us up to speed on what the attitude is on the street that would drive, normally hardworking people who are too busy to bother protesting, trying to make a living, to abandon that and head out into the streets and take up flags and placards and start screaming at the government from, 3,000-4,000 miles away. Were these significant protests? How big were they?
Well, they're the largest protests in Alberta for a long, long period of time. But the fact is, conservatives tend not to protest because, like us, they're working. They're not emotional. They're just, logical, hardworking people. And when you have 2,000 or 3,000 people show up at the Trudeau event, for example, it's undeniable. It's a big crowd. You can see it with your own eyes, right? So. But what's frustrating is that there's virtually no national coverage on those events or, best kind of symbolic coverage. And, it's the same thing in last week. Yesterday, I guess it was 1,500 or so that showed up in protest. And that the context is these are the people who don't really like to protest, number one. And number two, generally speaking, you have people who are very, very busy, and when they show up for a protest, they're very upset. They tell you that, right? So I would say that the media bias is huge. I see it all the time. I see it, and I think the Globe and Mail had a picture the other day of a car driving in the midst of what looked like a lot of smog, right?
Right.
And talking about global warming. This is Globe and Mail, right? So talking about global warming and CO2 and pollution. And what they failed to mention that this was a car driving through a forest fire, right? So Canadian forest fire, and I mean, how dishonest can they be? Like, it couldn't be more dishonest to take a picture of a car driving through forest fire smog and likening it to CO2 emissions and global warming and all the rest of it. So there's a propaganda campaign, and the media is all in on it. And, I sometimes think, well, are they that naive or that stupid? I don't know. But it's when they're dishonest, they cross the line for me. I mean, it could say, well, they're naive or stupid, one or the other, and you sort of have sympathy on them. But when they're plain out dishonest like that, there's no sympathy. I mean, they're just plain out, they're liars. And Globe and Mail in that article with the picture was straight up liars, right? So, and that's the pattern I see with mainstream media. That's why I tell people, what, alternative media, you need to support it. You need to get behind it. You need to get involved with it, because what we're seeing in mainstream media is basically it's a propaganda machine for a political party, for the Liberal Party. And that's just straight up a reality. In Canada, you could say CBC is a propaganda machine of Justin Trudeau. I shouldn't confuse Justin Trudeau with Pierre. It's like an insult to Pierre. I mean, Pierre was at least like, Justin Trudeau's not a smart man, and he's dishonest. Pierre was at least smart and dishonest. But I would say that Justin is just, has CBC in his pocket, and listeners need to really look very, very carefully at every opportunity they have to find out what's really good going on. And, sign up to Jason Kenney on Twitter and find out what's going on. That's an easy thing to do. It's free, right? You say, well, Jason Kenney's biased. Well, then sign up to Rachel Notley too. Be intelligent. Find out what Rachel is saying. Find out what Jason Kenney is saying. And don't let the CBC filter tell you what they're saying.
Yeah, and it's not just
think for yourself.
It's not just the CBC.
And I can go on and on. Like, you can do the same thing in Ontario. You have your, Rob Ford, Twitter. You can find out whatever Twitter and find out what everyone else is saying and find out what makes the most sense to you. We live in a world we don't have to rely on the CBC because they are blatantly biased, pro-liberal, Trudeau, and it's not just CBC. I'm just giving an example.
Right. Yeah. Well, that was just what I wanted to make sure that, people understand that at one point in time it might have been just the CBC, but it's not just the CBC anymore. It's really all of the mainstream media. The CBC is the worst of them, I think, but the truth is that they're all in the pocket of government now.
Especially with the $650 million slush fund to keep the papers alive. I mean, that's a whole nother topic. You just now you don't have one Pravda, you've got half a dozen, because there's not a paper chain in this country that I think that's going to be able to say no to that. I mean, if you're running a paper, you know what the subscriptions are doing, you know what the ad revenues are, and you look at that and say, how am I going to turn that down? And it's done with the most disgusting motives. It's done a year before the election because he knows he's in trouble. But I'm hoping, and I want to get to this, is leading to a question. I'm hoping that people will wake up to that and say, wait a minute, one of the right in the charter it says freedom of the press, right? Freedom of expression, freedom of the press, freedom of the ability so you can criticize your government without being afraid of retribution. How does this square with that? And I'm hoping Canadians are going to wake up. So let me ask you this in the final couple of minutes that we've got. what is it that the rest of Canada can do for you? What's the most productive thing that we can do? Because none of us are happy with this. Nobody wants to see, at least no sane person that I know of, wants to see a divorce between the West and the rest of Canada. I'm proud of the whole country, sea to sea. I wore the Queen's uniform. I do not want to see this idiot up in Ottawa tear it apart. Not on my watch. So what can we do? How can we help?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I mean, I want to say as well, I traveled the country as being involved politically with federal government. I've been in every province but Newfoundland, and I just love every part of this country too. And it's just so, it's so frustrating to see what's happening politically to tear this country apart. Number one is we need to stop C-69. Bill C-69, you need to talk to your senator, call your senator, and senators if possible, and let them know that Alberta is too important. If C-69 is passed, it'll destroy our country, and it will have a devastating effect economically as well. And that's by far the most important, I think, thing that anyone in this country can do right now. And and also support alternative media, including gather your own information. If you're in Quebec, find out who your premier is, and Twitter with him, and Twitter with the alternative, with whoever the official opposition is. I do that here in Alberta. I've got Rachel Notley's Twitter account. I have Jason Kenney's. I am informed firsthand. There's no excuse to be ignorant in Canada. There's no excuse. You can get firsthand information as to what your premier is saying and what the official opposition is saying. And you know what? If it means ignoring the mainstream media, that's probably the price mainstream media needs to pay for being so biased, is that we just need to disconnect from the BS and connect with actual communications from the real leaders and decide for yourself, right? So connect with alternative media and of course, block C-69 with every ounce of energy you have, because it's destroying Canada and it's going to undermine our economic well-being.
Okay, well, that's a short list, but it's a mighty important one because, I don't know how many people yet understand how steep the stakes are. When you look at this, because people have, I won't say the NIMBY syndrome, but they're like in every place in the country, taxes are high, debt loads are high, that kind of thing. And you've got people out there slugging it out every day, trying to put food on the table. So they don't have time. This is why I think shows like this and other shows like it are so very critical, so that people can actually find out what's going on and figure out where to spend their energy where it's most effective. And that's why I asked you, what can we do to help you? Because if we're going to get anybody calling senators and doing those kinds of things, it's a well you can't go to very often, because after a while you just join your white noise in the background. But on an issue like this, you got to do something. You can't sit idly by and let the country come apart at the seams.
Totally. And I keep the list short because people are busy. Block C-69. That is by far the most important thing and become educated. To find out for yourself what's going on and don't rely on the media. Those are the two pieces of advice I give to everyone in the country. And, the upside of technology is we have the ability to do that. And if you're lazy, you're going to listen to the mainstream media and get led astray. And so might as well be informed. And if you're going to take one step of action, block C-69.
All right, Roy. Unfortunately, we're out of time. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. It was informative as always. And we look forward to having you back on the show real soon. Keep us up to date about any changes. We'll see what we can get done on our end, because any little bit's going to help, because this is probably the most insidious piece of legislation ever to come down the pike.
Totally, and thank you so much, Nick and Joseph. Really appreciate you guys doing what you're doing, and support you 100%.
All right, thanks. You have a great night, Roy.
Thanks, Roy.
Thanks.
All right, that wraps it up for Joseph and I this evening. It's been a a pretty intense evening, especially the second hour.
Yeah, and again, I'm just going to quickly apologize for some of the technical glitches. We were switching computers here, and but in the end, things came through. And Roy's a good guy. I've known him for a long time, and very informed, and good interview, troubling interview.
Yeah, it is, but that's what it is.
Okay, so look, we're coming up to the end of the show here, guys, top of the hour. So let me just remind you to send your comments to us, comments at thecombatzone.ca. That's comments, plural, at thecombatzone.ca. And don't forget to tell your friends and neighbors and everybody on your list about our show. And we will catch you next week here in the Combat Zone.